thank you very much. This is a large topic, the New York City water and sewer system. And so I'm going to break it. I'm going to say something about what I see as the three basic components of the system: supply, where the water comes from; distribution, how we get it to you once it gets to the city; and then wastewater, because all that water has to go somewhere. It is a closed circuit, and the Department of Environmental Protection in New York City deals with that whole cycle, from the water when it comes upstate to when the effluent, which is a technical term, leaves the wastewater treatment plant that I'm going to talk a little bit about. But before I get into the specifics of those three components, I do like to get a sense of what, if anything, my audience knows. So, who took a shower today? Who flushed the toilet? Who knows where New York City's water actually comes from? And if you worked at DEP, you can't answer.
Catskills.
The Catskills, yes. Part? Anywhere else? Talk about three of those. How much water do New Yorkers consume every day? 1 billion gallons a day. 1 billion gallons a day. Now, I have been using that number since I learned it in 2010 because I had to when I became commissioner. But I'm going to tell you a secret. It always was totally incomprehensible to me. I don't have any, it boggles the mind, a number that large. So what is 1 billion gallons? So think about it this way. The Empire State Building is 37 million cubic square feet. And so if you think of the Empire State Building as the container that New York City's water comes in, New Yorkers consume 3.5 Empire State Buildings of water every day, okay? It helps a little bit in terms of getting a sense of the magnitude. If you go down to 5th Avenue and 34th Street and look at how big the Empire State Building is, that gives you a sense of how much water New Yorkers use. Now, where does all that water come from? And somebody said the Catskills, so that's a good. What we have here, and now I'm going to go into the supply side of the water system. Where does New York City's water come from? And this map gives you a broad overview of the system. There are 3 watersheds, and a watershed is just an area where you take all of the rivers, groundwater, any precipitation, everything that falls into that area. That's the watershed, and generally is defined by certain geographic elements that, in the United States, actually, the Rockies is a big part. Everything that falls east of the Rockies is the East Coast, and west is, the rest of the United States. But these watersheds, 3 watersheds really serve New York City. The Croton Watershed, which was the first, talk about that in a minute. But then 90% of the city's water on any given day comes from 2 watersheds, the Catskill and Delaware watersheds, which is, in this map, are combined. The geography of it is essentially combined. And there are 19 reservoirs and 3 lakes that hold the New York City's water. Now, I said New Yorkers consume 1 billion gallons a day. Those reservoirs hold 580 billion gallons of water in storage, which is awesome. I'm not going to show you another picture of the Empire State Building, but think about it this way. If it stopped raining today, theoretically, and there are reasons from an engineering perspective that this wouldn't actually work, we could go more than a year with water that we have in storage, because the reservoirs are actually at 95% right now. And if you want to know the level that the reservoirs are at, the Department of Environmental Protection's website helpfully tells you at any given time what the reservoir levels are. So we have the Croton Watershed, the CatskillDelaware Watersheds, the 19 reservoirs, so that is kind of the big picture of the system, but that, of course, didn't spring up overnight. And here's the thing about water, which I find so interesting, and you really learn this when you work for a water utility. Most people have no idea how the water gets there, but I'll tell you what, they sure expect it to be there. when they want it. When your water is off, you have a big problem, much worse even than the power being off, right? So so hopefully you're going to be a little ahead of the game after this. So the first system that I mentioned is the Croton system. Now, how did this system get built? Well, there was a lot of ingenuity in it. There was a lot of planning that went into it. But first and foremost, there was necessity. Before 1842, when the first pipe from the Croton Watershed that I just showed you on the east side of the Hudson River was tapped and brought 90 million gallons of water a day to New York City, some of which filled this reservoir that now sits on the site, that sits on what is now the New York City Public Library. That was actually one of the later reservoirs that was built, but there were some of these in different parts of the city. Before 1842, all water in New York City came from wells that were sunk. The first well was sunk in 1677. There's a company called the Manhattan Company, of which Aaron Burr was a part, that laid wood pipes in lower Manhattan. A little bit of trivia for you. The way the fire company got access to that water was they would take a hatchet and basically cut into the pipe and then plug it up, and that was a fire plug. So that's where that term comes from. But all of that water came from wells. And eventually that well water, its quality started to deteriorate. And then in 1832, there was a cholera epidemic in the city. More than 3,000 people died. There was another epidemic about 15 years later. And this was one of the main impetuses that pushed the city to pass the legislation and work with the state passed legislation to get the Croton Aqueduct funded. And this is when New York City first went outside its own boundaries to get water. And has anybody here ever read The Great Bridge by David, what's his name? McCullough. Okay, the engineers who built the Brooklyn Bridge, the panel of engineers that actually judged Roebling's design for the bridge, they all worked on the Croton Aqueduct. These were considered the best engineers of their day. And so that was the beginning. Now, of course, New York City continued to grow long after 1842, long after the second Croton Aqueduct. And in 1905, the state of New York formed the Board of Water Supply and charged it with, quote, finding new sources of water for New York City. And they published in about the same year, 1906, I think, 1907, what I personally consider to be, and I didn't get to keep this because it was the agency's book, but I consider to be one of the great examples of long-term planning that I've ever seen, which was the plan for New York City's water supply that came out in 1905, 1906. It basically contemplated everything that I showed you on that first map. The Delaware Aqueduct, the Catskill Aqueduct, all those reservoirs, and a bunch of other stuff that actually still hasn't been built. And so anyway, they published this plan, and then by 1915, they had built the Shokan Reservoir, which is in the Catskill side. Let me just go back here for 1 second. If you see the Shokan Reservoir, see that it says Esopus Creek, then the Shokan Reservoir. That is then the Catskill Aqueduct flows from there, and it dumps into Catskill Reservoir in Westchester, and then goes into Hillview Reservoir, which is in Yonkers, right across the street from the dog track. So if you ever want to go to the dog track, then you can take a look across the street and see Hillview Reservoir. You won't be able to access it because it actually is highly guarded. It's also incredibly dangerous because there's lots of chlorine there. But anyway, the Catskill Aqueduct went online in 1917. And then the Delaware Aqueduct followed. In 1931, the Supreme Court ruled against the state of New Jersey and allowed the city to impound, basically forming the reservoirs, the Papacton Reservoir and one of the other ones there, the headwaters of the Delaware River for use by the city. So there is still this multi-state organization that exists between New York, New Jersey, Delaware, that governs how that water gets released but this was a big deal. And so the final piece of this part of the system was built in 1964. So you might be saying to me, well, Kaz, this is great, but it's all old. I mean, so this stuff is all built. What's the big deal? Well, it turns out that as good, and these are just some pictures of this is the building of the Catskill Aqueduct. That is the dinner celebrating the opening of the Shokan Reservoir. Looks pretty good. But it turns out that this infrastructure, which is highly managed, and actually there's a control center, a couple of control centers in the watershed outside of the city, where they literally can control remotely the water flowing from these reservoirs into these aqueducts, because that Hillview Reservoir, that is basically at the city line, and I'm going to get into the distribution side of this in a minute. But that holds 1 billion gallons, and that is called the balancing reservoir for the city. And that, on a daily basis, is what is used to calibrate how much water is actually flowing into the city. So anyway, the Delaware Aqueduct, which went live, I think, in 1936 or 1954, something like that. This crosses underneath the Hudson River up near the town of Wawarsing. And it turns out that it has a leak. Now that leak, I say leak, you might think of water dripping from a faucet. This leaks about 25 million gallons a day. Now you know what 1 billion gallons is, so it's not the Empire State Building, but it's a lot of water. That leak was discovered in 1990, and then DEP and subsequent administrations went through what governments sometimes do when confronted by a huge, expensive problem of potentially catastrophic proportions, but nobody really knows how catastrophic, so the best thing to do is to study it to death. And so we had many, many studies about this leak, but nobody was going to do anything to fix it. Enter Mike Bloomberg. And Mike, who was mayor for 3 terms, basically said, one of the questions that he said at the beginning of his administration was, what could really shut the city down? And somebody was smart enough to tell him, if we didn't have water. And this led to 2 big investments. The first was a big investment in City Water Tunnel number 3, but much lesser well known, but I think will also go down as one of the great infrastructure investments, not only of the administration, but of a piece with the history of this, which you're getting a sense of the magnitude of this, right? This is a bypass tunnel that's 2.5 miles long. It's being dug right now. And the big moment's going to come in 2022 when they have to actually shut down the Delaware Aqueduct and then break into it and have the water bypass the leaks and then continue on its way to New York City. Now, one thing for this crowd to keep in mind, make sure you keep your eye on doing this. No administration, whoever's in power at that time, is going to be excited about doing this. Why is that? Because the Delaware Aqueduct provides about 500 million gallons of water to New York City. Nobody actually knows what's going to happen when they turn this off. Is the aqueduct going to collapse? Is it the only thing holding it up? There's a reason that this was studied for so long before it was acted on. But the fact is, at some point, if this leaks long enough, there will be a failure. And so it again shows the foresight of the Bloomberg administration and now the de Blasio administration following through on it. But the big moment's going to come when they figure out, when they turn it off and plug this in. So this is under construction right now. And just to give you a sense of scale, just this 2.5 miles cost $2 billion. So projects today are a lot more expensive. Now, I've told you a little bit about the supply side. What about distribution? What happens when the water gets into Hillview Reservoir in Yonkers? Could we go to the first web page? Well, what happens then? Well, you guessed it, more tunnels. There are 3 city tunnels. The little blue dot there, that's Hillview Reservoir. I just like saying Yonkers, so I'm going to keep saying it. And there are 3 city tunnels. The first one, City Tunnel number 1, went into service, the blue one in 1917, the purple one in 1936, and the orange one, which is still under construction today, was built in 3 stages. The bonds for it was authorized in 1954. Construction started in 1970. Phase 1 from Hillview Reservoir to Central Park went into service in a beautiful ceremony that I attended when I was at the Parks Department in 1998. And Phase 2 went into service when I was standing next to Mike Bloomberg in City Hall Park, and we ceremoniously turned a fake wheel to and had the fountain go on. The fact is, we would never just test it then. It had been on for weeks. But it was great. It was a great little event. It cost $4.5 billion of investment that Mayor Bloomberg made. The tunnel had actually been finished. What had to be done that cost so much money is, it's one thing to build the tunnel to get the water here, but then how do you get it to the distribution network in the street bed? Because that aqueduct goes down from 600 to 1,200 feet below the city. And so there are these shaft sites that are built, and the shaft site, the water comes up the shaft site and gets fed into the distribution network. Now, the true genius of the system, much like the water that's coming through those aqueducts and Hillview Reservoir, which is 300 feet above sea level, it's all basically gravity fed. There are no pumps, and there don't have to be, because the engineers, those engineers who, some of whom worked on Croton and then the Brooklyn Bridge, and their sons and daughters worked maybe on, and I forgot to mention that the tunnel boring machine that I showed you that was right next to the Delaware, the bypass leak, that is named Nora after the first civil engineer in the United States, who was a woman who worked at the Bureau of Water Supply, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, the boring machines for the 7th Avenue Subway were named Emma and Georgina after the mayor's daughters, so it's a little closer to home. But that is pretty cool. But anyway, it's all gravity fed. And what that means is that you don't need a pump to get up to 6 stories in New York City. Now, buildings that are more than 6 stories have pumps, and we have buildings that are much higher than 6 stories, obviously. But that's pretty amazing. So these 3 tunnels serve New York City. The 3rd stage of City Tunnel number 3, the Brooklyn and Queens leg, is also built. It was actually finished more than 10 years ago. There are 2 shaft sites, just 2, that have to be put in place to feed the distribution network in Brooklyn and Queens, and then that will finally be finished. And then there are other parts of the system that were in that 1905 plan, amazingly, that aren't even here. So that gets us from 125 miles away in the watershed to the water being distributed. In fact, if you would go right here, that's just a nice picture from 1978 of City Tunnel number 3, before it was 20 years before it was activated. The Shokan Reservoir, when it was built, and the other reservoirs that serve New York City, they were not built in a Garden of Eden virgin land. There were actually 4 towns that had to be resettled, and they were essentially sunk. They became the sites of these reservoirs. And that removal of body sign actually shows the city compensated people $65 to disinter their relatives and bury them somewhere else. Now, this is the kind of thing that, just imagine today if you could even politically get something like this done. But it's, so we're pretty lucky to have inherited this system. All of those towns, people were compensated, and there's a great history in a museum, and DEP actually still supports those towns and has built wastewater treatment plants for all of them, but there is still some feeling by some of the ancestors of those people that the city, New York City, like many still do in the state legislature, think that New York City, is a blight on the state, and that the city, takes from its upstate neighbors. In this case, it happens to be true. So, talked about the tunnels and getting the water here. What happens after that? Now, here's where things get really fun. Everybody loves New York City water. It's some of the best, highest quality water in the world. You don't need to filter it. But after you flush the toilet, spit out your toothpaste, do whatever it is that you might do, businesses who use our water. Well, then all of a sudden it's waste. And then it needs to go somewhere. And so just as there is a 7,000-mile sewer water network bringing the water from the street into your building, there is a 7,000-mile sewer network underneath the city streets that takes the wastewater, which is what we call it, to be treated. But when did that happen? Well, what's interesting to me is the supply part of the system has been in development since 1842 from outside the city, and even before then we had pipes in the ground. Until basically the 1930s, wastewater was just dumped into the East River, the Hudson River. In the 80s, they started to, you basically, I'll tell you about the byproducts of the wastewater treatment process are basically water and sludge. The sludge used to just be dumped, a mile offshore. And up till 1992, the city was dumping 4.5 tons of sludge in the Atlantic Ocean a year. So in 1937, that all started to change with the opening of the first wastewater treatment plant in New York City at Coney Island. I'm sorry, it was 1935. The picture is from 1937. And it's a good thing, too, because you can see, imagine now you actually can see on the news there are some don't swim alerts and things that happen today occasionally. Back then, no such thing, but you just kind of knew by looking at it whether you should swim in the water, I guess. This was the first wastewater treatment plant. Today, there are 14 wastewater treatment plants that serve New York City. These are the the city's broken into these 14 waste sheds, so to speak. The crown jewel of these is the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And let me just say, make a plug, there's a great visitor center there, and this is super cool. You can go here, do a tour. Has anybody been there? All right, a few people, I see some nods. And you can learn all about the wastewater treatment process. I won't go into all of the details, but except to say that these 14 wastewater treatment plants treat 1.3 billion gallons of wastewater a day. So it's 1 billion coming in, 1.3 billion going out. You figure out the difference. And it is the sludge. The way the wastewater treatment process works is basically like your stomach. It comes in, it sits, the heavy stuff sinks. They take all of that, bugs feed on it. Water is chlorinated, and but it is very much like the digestion process. You can read a lot more about the science of it, but it is not really high tech. It's actually pretty cool. And today, all of that sludge, most of that sludge is actually reused in agriculture for agricultural purposes, and some other neat things that we do with it. So now, the story doesn't end there. Because in addition to the 1.3 billion gallons of wastewater that New Yorkers generate every day, everybody knows the saying, the concrete jungle. New York City is not a very permeable place. When it rains, where does the water go? Most of it flows into catch basins. Everybody know what a catch basin is? It's one of those grates that are at the corners of streets. Quick, this is a classic consulting type question. How many catch basins are there in New York City? Who's doing the math? Come on.
100,000.
Not bad. 144,000. And if you're wondering, there are 109,000 fire hydrants, just in case somebody asks. So you can see here what happens when it rains. The water has to have somewhere to go. So on a dry day, I just explained to you fairly concisely, water goes into building, water comes out of building, water goes into a pipe, and POTW stands for publicly owned treatment works. This is one of the government terms that somebody somewhere thought would be, descriptive. But this actually flows to one of those 14 wastewater treatment plants. When it rains, you'll see that other, that basically next to the car is essentially a catch basin. Water then flows in, except there's more water than the pipes can hold. And so some of it goes through an outfall pipe into the river. 12% of what flows into the surrounding waterways of New York City is sewage. But don't worry about it. Worry about it a little bit. And so what about that? There are about 30 billion gallons of what we call combined sewer overflow. And the reason we call it combined sewer overflow is because most of the city is served by these combined sewers. Stormwater and wastewater coming from households and businesses go into the same pipe. Now, in some parts of the city, there's separate system, but it's not most of the city. Most of the city is combined sewer overflow. So, in 1832, the big challenge was supply. How do we get enough fresh water to keep people healthy and keep the city growing? Probably the same problem through the beginning of the 20th century, really. That was the problem that mayors and governors were trying to solve, and public administrations for the city of New York. Then in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it no longer became acceptable to dump sewage into our surrounding waterways. Wastewater treatment process is born. Wastewater treatment plants are built. It actually was during the Great Depression and the Works Progress Administration that a bunch of these wastewater treatment plants were built, some pretty cool artifacts. The big challenge today are these combined sewer overflows and dealing with how we can take the concrete jungle and make it more permeable. And this is where Mayor Bloomberg, this is also a $2 billion investment, launched in 2010 or 11 the Green Infrastructure Plan. What is green infrastructure? Well, if it probably has already become abundantly clear to you that the water system is full of lots of big gray pipes that are built far underground. And in fact, the Department of Environmental Protection is very big at building those big gray pipes. However, big infrastructure is not always the best thing for every problem. Now, interestingly, DEP, before the Green Infrastructure Plan, has built in certain places these huge receptacles for stormwater that then they feed to the wastewater treatment plants. After a storm, they cost hundreds of millions of dollars and are only useful when it rains. We came up with a different way to do it, and this was developed during the Bloomberg administration, which was to develop small installations like these, green roofs, blue roofs, bioswales that capture stormwater and then slowly have it filter in various different ways into the soil and treat, to use to grow plants and do other things. And so the plan right now is there will ultimately be, I think, about 10,000 of these types of installations all around the city. And the calculations that we did, because the original plan had been to build a bunch of these receptacles to hold stormwater, we had to prove to the feds and to the state who regulate all this stuff that we could have better water quality, and this is harbor water quality now, not drinking water quality, and we could do it a lot less expensively if you let us do green infrastructure. And it turns out that we were able to do this for more than $2 billion less, and we deferred more than $5 billion worth of gray infrastructure investments as they put this plan into effect. And so this is the challenge of our time right now, and it really has now been underway for 6 or 7 years, but this is a 25-year issue, a 25-year challenge. And so it's pretty exciting stuff. That, in a nutshell, is the New York City water system from the watershed to the Hudson.